Today, believe it or not, is actually Thursday. No joke! Today is Linux Thursday, the most glorious holiday of the week, where we talk about Linux and nothing but Linux, or at least open sourcey and free software-y stuff. It's fantastic. Here's how this works, for those of you new around here. You ask me a bunch of questions, and I attempt to answer them with my feeble little brain. Let's rock and roll. First question out of the gate. Who is more evil / detrimental to the free and open source community? Microsoft, Google or Alphabet, IBM, or Adobe? Alex, holy moly. Okay. To start with, that is a wonderfully, delightfully loaded question. Thank you, Alex. That is just the type of question I like around here. I already am feeling people hopping to their keyboards to tell me why Microsoft or Google or IBM is not evil. However, I am extraordinarily confident that no pro-Linux, pro-free software, pro-open source person is going to do the same with Adobe. I don't think anyone's going to come to the defense of Adobe here. And that's kind of interesting, considering Microsoft has a long-stated history of fighting against open source or free software or Linux. And yet, I think more people are going to come to the defense of Microsoft than Adobe. That's an interesting thing, considering Adobe pretty much only makes closed source. I mean, they've released a few little bits of SDKs and API sets as open source under various licenses over the years, but they've really only just dabbled. They've touched the water a little bit. They put their big toe in to see what the water was like, and immediately pulled their big toe out and said, no open source for us. So I don't know. I don't really think they're all that detrimental to the free and open source community, however. They just simply make a lot of proprietary software. They don't really attack free software. They don't really attack open source. And yet they're going to have more people who are going to not rush to their support and their aid than Microsoft, Google, or IBM. That's fascinating to me. I think Adobe is just simply irrelevant. Would it be cool if they released Photoshop, etc. as open source? Yes. Would it be cool if they released Premiere on a Linux or FreeBSD or some other open source or free software platform? Yes. Do they really support open source in any way? Not really. But just the same, they're not terribly relevant. They don't really get involved in any way. Microsoft, Google, and IBM do. They do get involved. So I think you could make a case for all three of them that they're either all being really beneficial towards open source and Linux, or they're being really harmful. And the reality is, I don't know. I think everything, like in all aspects of life, is just a very, very mixed bag. Shades of gray, well beyond 50. I don't know. See, with Microsoft, you have a decades-long history of fighting against open source, free software, and Linux. But yet they proclaim their love of it, and they do invest rather heavily nowadays in it. So you have to stop and think. Either that's part of a dastardly evil scheme that is just continuing their decades-long obsession with trying to destroy open source and free software, or they have, in fact, changed their ways. And I think for a lot of people, the jury's out. So I think for Microsoft, we have to go like this and put them off to the side. For IBM, let's look at IBM for a little bit, because IBM has a bigger, longer history in the computing space than any of these other companies do. Microsoft's been around a long time, but IBM is a big critical player in early computing. I mean, not as early computing as, like, let's say GE and some of the other companies, but they really got into it, and Microsoft would not be the player it is today if IBM hadn't tapped them on the shoulder. And IBM was considered by the hobbyist computer market of the world, all of us, if we had been around in the 1970s and early 80s, we would have considered IBM to be the evil empire. They were Big Brother. that Apple ad from 1984 about the introduction of the Macintosh, spoofing on George Orwell's 1984. 1984 won't be like 1984. They were really spoofing on IBM as well at that point. That was back when Apple was still a little bit more free and open and free-lovey. Case in point, for those of you who weren't around back then or haven't kind of studied up on this piece of history, early Apple machines, the early ones, they actually came with schematics on how to, do anything you wanted to them, on how to build them, on how they were built, so you could modify them yourself. Steve Wozniak made sure of that. And so Apple was, at least in its early days, a very open company comparatively. That changed quickly and things went, but that's a whole different story. So IBM has gone back and forth. IBM has, sometimes they've been Big Brother, sometimes they've been the evil empire. Long before Microsoft was the evil empire, it was IBM. And sometimes when Microsoft or other companies become the evil empire, IBM becomes, one of the good guys, right? I mean, they've been investing into Linux for quite some time. So it's a really tough one. That's a really hard question to answer. Honestly, if I were to put my money in any of them, it would be Google and Alphabet. And here's why. Google and Alphabet have standardized on many open source and free software things like Linux, and in that process have contributed to those projects in some significant ways, and that cannot be denied. However, their overall business model, I feel like, is the thing that will contribute the most negatively to free software, because they rely on advertising, data collection, monitoring, surveillance, and subscriptions and services, as opposed to you buy something, you own it, right? And the old school Microsoft, just like the old school IBM, was more akin to, I buy a thing, a piece of hardware, a box of software, and it's mine. And sure, some lawyers might try to get you to agree to some EULA that says you don't really own it, but it kind of goes back and forth of dubiousness. But you buy a thing and you have it, right? It's yours. You can reinstall it as many times as you want. At least that's how it was in the old days, pre-license key activations. And really, there was a lot of time pre that. Whereas Google just circumvents that entirely. I mean, you don't go buy a box of Google software. That's never happened. It's just never happened. Not one time have you been able to go down to a store and buy a box with a Google flash drive, DVD, CD, floppy disks, anything in it, because Google wants you to subscribe to services. And so even though they've focused on open source and free software as the basis for a lot of the things they do, those things that they build on top of that, they don't have to give to you for free, even if it's based on GPL software, because you're not downloading it. If it's running on the server side, it's Google's and they don't have to give it to you. And so they kind of circumvent the whole ideals of free software entirely by their very business model. And so I would say that they're the most detrimental, because even though it would appear at first blush like they are possibly, of these four, the most pro-open source, the most pro-free software, the most based on Linux. I mean, look at both Android and Chrome OS. Their platforms are Linux, for heaven's sake. And yet, you don't really have access to them. Not really. Not in most cases, especially when you're talking about the server side of it. So I would say that they're the most detrimental because it's deceptive, in my opinion. That said, I don't trust Microsoft as far as I can throw them. And this episode, before we get into all the other questions, is brought to you in part by Pogo Linux, who has Linux right there in their business and domain name. That's how you know that they're hardcore. If you go over to pogolinux.com, oh my heavens, the servers, the workstations, the storage servers that you can put together and spec out will make your head explode with radness. Talk about terabytes? Nay. You can spec out a petabyte, baby. Oh yeah, you can. Oh yeah, you can. You need a 1U server? You need a NAS? You need a 6U server? Yes, you do is the correct answer, pogolinux.com. All right, next question is from Kim. I would so much like to hear your opinion on the Sailfish OS phone. I have owned a Sailfish OS phone since the first Jola back in 2013, and I know that the Librem 5 phone is coming in 2019, but why give twice as much for a phone with free software when the Sailfish OS is also a Debian-based phone that respects your privacy as a user? Kim, okay, so I want this is actually kind of interesting. I do have some opinions on Sailfish. So for those of you who don't know, Sailfish is a Debian-based platform. However, there are many aspects to it that are not open source. The main Sailfish user interface is closed source. There are open source variants that you can get, but the one that Jola makes is closed source, and I feel like that's very problematic. I'm just not 100% comfortable with that. The other side of this is that when we're talking about a phone, especially a smartphone that is essentially your desktop computer put into a really small form factor that you carry with you all the time, I'm going to need it to be as secure as possible. And so while having a predominantly open source based system gets me a good chunk of the way there, like the Sailfish OS, discounting the massive blob of proprietary software that sits on top. It gets you there. The old Mamo devices, the N810s, the N800s, N900s, the N9s, etc., those get you a good chunk of the way there as well. But there's still problems relating to the hardware and the way the software interfaces with the hardware. In most smartphones, what you end up having is the baseband cellular modem, the piece of the hardware that's required in order to have data access to the cellular networks, tends to be built in as part of a system on a chip with the core processor and RAM, which means that baseband has access to the contents of the RAM itself of your main system. That's a fundamental security issue from my standpoint. And if there were no phone on the market, no phone coming down the line that even sought to solve that issue, I would agree with you, Kim. I would say Sailfish OS becomes at least one of the viable options out there. I don't like that they have a big chunk of closed source on there. I don't like that they're the kind of people that would do that. That bothers me a little bit. I mean, I'm fine with them. It's their freedom to put that product out there, and it's my freedom to go, no thanks. But since we have the Librem 5 coming, and I know a little conflict of interest because Purism, the company behind the Librem 5, does sponsor this show. But part of the reason they sponsor this show is because I want companies that fundamentally agree with me to be sponsoring this show. You'll notice I don't have companies like Microsoft does not sponsor this show. Visa or MasterCard or Google do not sponsor this show. IBM does not sponsor this show. And I doubt that any of those companies ever will, whether they want to or not, because they just would not fundamentally jive with my personal ethos. But with the Librem 5 coming, what the company is trying to do is actually separate things out. So like having a baseband, right? That baseband be fully open source and free software is not happening. It's not something that any company, including Purism, has been able to crack that nut. They've not been able to accomplish that. But it is possible to separate that out from the core CPU and RAM that runs the entire rest of your system. So, and I have not gotten my hands on the dev kits for the Purism's Librem 5 yet, so I can't speak to it, the real nitty-gritties. But from what I understand from following along and talking with their engineers as they go, is they basically are going to be communicating to it. So it's sort of like if you had a USB dongle that you plugged into your machine, your PC, let's say, and that USB dongle had the cellular baseband on it. Well, that cellular baseband, while it would be closed, it would not have direct access to the RAM in your system unless you let it, right? Because it's not part of the system on a chip design. Almost every phone out there, including the Jola, is all built in together, so the baseband has access to everything you do. So if you separate those out, whether you connect it via USB or a serial connection or iSCSI or whatever you want to connect it with, right? And you just are communicating with it that way, you are basically sending messages into your baseband and getting data back out of it, which allows you to control what it can see. So yes, in that regard, it still has access to your data you're sending around, right? So then there's an additional issue that you have to overcome, is making sure that before your data goes out, it's as encrypted or difficult to decipher as possible. So that's why, like you see with Librem 5, if you follow along on their blog, they do these status updates every now and then. They try to embrace things like Matrix and various other communications platforms that are just a bit more secure, a bit more decentralized, a bit more encrypted. So by the time the data that you're sending out hits the cellular baseband, it's already encrypted. Most phones, like you have an iPhone or an Android phone, the baseband, which, you know, can be controlled by the cellular network itself, already has access to everything unencrypted on your system that they want. It's all theirs. There's nothing you can do in the operating system, to my knowledge, that will protect your data from that baseband. Nothing. I mean, they've got it. It's theirs. If they want it, they can, it's theirs. That's the difference with like what the Librem 5 is doing. It's not just that it's Linux based. And yes, it's Linux based. And but it's got that separation between the CPU and the baseband, and that's great. The other thing is the flexibility in having choice over what your user interface and your environment is. I want in my phone the ability to treat it like a computer. I want to be able to put whatever operating system I want on it. I want it to be not just unlocked, but as open and easy to support as possible. So I want to be able to run a Debian-based distro on it, or a Fedora-based distro on it, or a Gentoo if I'm a really crazy person-based distro on it. Those are things I want to be able to do. And the way the Librem 5 team is approaching it, whether it's going to be doable because, you know, all the drivers and everything will be in the Linux kernel upstream at launch or not, I'm not 100% certain. But the way they're approaching it is fully free software working with upstream. So at the very least, you'll be able to, you know, right from the get-go, I want to use GNOME, I want to use KDE, I want to use XFCE, right? I mean, how cool would that be? Have a friggin' phone running, you know, Mate. Sure, some people may mock that and say that's insanity. That's just not usable. What are you going to use menu items with your big fat fingers? And you know what? Yeah, that might be a little difficult, but oh, cool. That's my personal thoughts on it. Sailfish is cool. It has massive benefits, massive, over, say, iOS or even Android. It really does. But there are still drawbacks, and solving those drawbacks is, I think, a critically important thing for everybody. And the Librem 5 kind of does that. So that's why I'm looking forward to that. Personally, for me right now, I've got this Android phone here, right? It's a little Android phone, and it's fine. It's fine. I was running Copperhead on it, but Copperhead is no more. Copperhead is an Android variant that, you know, strips out all the googly stuff, all of it, hardens it up a bit, and then uses things like F-Droid, which is a nice free software repository for Android software, for installing the applications as the kind of Play Store alternative. And it was great. It was great. It was a great way to tide me over until I got something like a Librem 5. My phone, now that I don't have updates to Copperhead anymore because it's no more, I'm looking around and I'm like, well, what else could tide me over? What could tide me over until I've got something like a Librem 5? And I honestly, if I'm looking at things from a security standpoint, if I'm looking at things from I don't want people spying and whatnot on me standpoint, either I'd go with maybe a Sailfish, maybe an N900, the old Nokia N900s. Those are great, also Debian based. A bit more free software than Sailfish, but only, I mean, we're splitting hairs here. I mean, it also had some significant binary blobs in it as well. Or honestly, if once you're going down that road and you're just saying, I'm going to have a temporary phone for a while and I don't want it to be an Android or iOS phone that's tracking you everywhere I go, I might almost go something really retro and ridiculous. Like, I mean, not totally retro, but like go to the early days of smartphones. Go to like a Palm OS Trio. You know what I mean? Technically, you're going to get online with it. Technically, it's got a web browser. It's not going to work with like half the websites out there, though it'll work with lunduke.com because I don't discriminate. I try and just code in pure HTML. But technically, I mean, why not? Honestly, you probably have more security, and several security experts are having their heads explode right now by me even saying this, but you probably have more security than a stock Android or iOS device if you went back to an old Windows mobile phone. Now, I'm not talking Windows Phone. I'm talking like Windows Mobile 5, like from a decade ago. You'd probably have a little bit more of a secure experience because people just aren't going to care enough to hack you. Anyway, but the Librem 5, that to me, that looks like the right way forward. And I think they're kind of taking the best approach that can possibly be taken at this point. And I think that's pretty cool. Jason asks, what inspired you to initially take the plunge into the Linux world? Mine was basically, I was tired of the bleep show that was Windows. And when I lost my MP3 collection to NTFS corruption, ouch, I rage quit to Linux and never looked back. Oh man. There was no one moment for me. I mean, there really wasn't. I was always operating system hopping. I mean, if I wasn't on, DOS and Windows, I was on OS2 or BOS or Mac OS way pre the whole Mac OS 10 thing. And then Next Step and OpenStep in the early Mac OS days, back when it was still gray and there was no Aqua user interface, back with Mac OS 10 Server 1.0. And a wide variety of those sorts of operating system. QNX I ran for a while, believe it or not. And so I was always hopping around with systems, and I always liked Linux. It tended to be SUSE, early SUSE, like SUSE 6.4, I want to say, before OpenSUSE became a thing. Or Red Hat. And I can't remember the version of Red Hat was the first one I really dove into, but it was long before Fedora was a thing. It was when it was just Red Hat and SUSE, right? And back when SUSE was had lots of periods and uppercase and lowercase parts of the word SUSE. There was no one thing. I always got grumpy at Windows. Really honestly, it was Windows 95 onward where I started getting really, really soured on Windows. Windows 3.11, up through that point, I always really liked Windows. And it wasn't that it was great. It was that it was simple. It was simple and lightweight. It was just an operating environment that, you could do some things in. It was not a great, full-featured, robust, preemptive multitasking operating system. It was just kind of this funky shell. And it did what it did okay. It was quirky, but you knew the quirks and it was fine and you lived with that. And so I appreciated that for what it was. It was never quite as cool as, say, Amiga OS, right? It was never as cool as the Amiga Workbench. And never as powerful, never as fast, never as good at multitasking. It was never as good at that. But for stock commodity PC hardware, it wasn't bad. And then, the Windows 9X series came, and it was exciting for about 5 minutes, and it was buggy, and it just gets slower. Every release got slower, and I think that's what it was for me. It was that death of 1,000 paper cuts. Every release got slower. Every release got crashier, with a few exceptions. Honestly, Windows NT 4 wasn't bad stability-wise, and Windows 2000, Windows NT 5 actually was pretty good stability-wise. I worked on that one when I was at Microsoft. It really wasn't bad stability-wise. It still had lots of problems, though, and had lots more just crud jammed in there that didn't need to be in there. And so there was just, thousands of little paper cuts. I didn't like the speed. I didn't like the stability. Oh my gosh. When Windows ME happened, I just wanted to stab I mean, you guys all remember that if you were around during Windows Millennium Edition. It was awful. Oh man, it was bad. And I never left in those days the Windows and Mac and OS2 worlds completely behind. I always had an OS2 machine. I ran a BBS, a multi-line BBS under OS2 for years, and I liked OS2 back then. And I think I started really moving to Linux more and more around, the time between like 2004 and 2007 is when I really went full time. Probably by about 2007, I was about as full time as you could get, other than I did still work on some Mac and Windows software. But I did it all from Linux and started getting more and more hardcore about it. And then as the years went on, the Mac machines just went away and the Windows machines slowly went away. And I came to a point where I realized I didn't have Windows anymore. Like I have Windows 3.1.1 running in virtual machines, but that's it. I don't have any other version of Windows in my house. I think in a box somewhere, I've got boxes of newer versions of Windows. And by newer versions, I mean maybe up through XP and Vista. Excuse me, guys. I'm still getting over a cold over here. Holy moly, I need to drink some more. Talk amongst yourselves. I'll give you a topic. Talk about virtual machines and how they just don't work quite right. I'm back. Holy moly. That was hardcore. Woo. Hey, I'm pretty happy though. 26 minutes into the show and I hadn't had a coughing fit. That's actually a record for me for this week. You guys should see how it's been going over here. So no, I didn't have a singular moment like you did, Jason, where, I had to rage quit. I'm more of a slow, seething hatred quit is more of how it went. And nowadays I'm just all Linux all the time, except for, sometimes I'll run Haiku or FreeDOS over here, some other free and open source system, but pretty much all Linux now. Oh man, this cough is unstoppable. Is it going to end? I don't know. I'm going to power through though. I'm not going to stop. You can't stop me from answering Linuxy questions, people. Jason asks, why do I want this? And he's referencing the Dragonbox Pyra, the pyra-handheld.com. And you want that because you're human. So for those of you who don't know what this is, a long time ago, I think many, many years ago, there was a thing called Pandora. And the Open Pandora was this great little handheld system. Excuse me, guys. Holy moly. Oh, I broke my streak. That 26 minutes is now over. Let's see if I can go another 20. And it was really, really cool. There was some production and supply issues with it, but it was still really cool. It was a very expensive handheld, and it was kind of shaped like a Nintendo DS, right? It had a little flip up, little clamshell design, screen up top, keyboard, and some controllers down below, so you can play games. You could treat it like a portable desktop, right? It was really it wasn't a netbook. It was more of a palm top mixed with a handheld game device treated like more of a modern Linux desktop, a little ARM-based beauty. It was great. The Pyra is the successor to that. Now, the Pyra is great. It's got a 5-inch screen on it, and it's awesome. It's running full-blown Debian, so you can put whatever you want on it. I can't remember the exact CPU on it. It's an ARM-based, I want to say it's like 1.5 gigahertz ARM-based processor. Cool. Like, you could use it as your desktop. No doubt you could. However, it was announced many years ago, and it's gone through a lot of ups and downs on its road to shipping. It has appeared to be almost shipping for the last 3 years, I believe. I made a comment about it about 2 years ago. I want to say on this show, I made a comment about it about 2 years ago, and I got contacted by people who really want it. And they're like, dude, no, it's coming. It's about to ship. Like they just posted another status update where they were working on brand new hardware and they got some new PCBs in and they're ready to go. That was about 2 years ago. And I don't want to poo-poo on them. I don't want to rain on the parade, but it's just never seemed to get to the point of actually shipping. I hope the Pyra ships. I really do, because I want one. I really want one. And I think some of the design is really cool. I think that the team behind it, the individuals who've put their time into it, have done an exceptionally good job on a job that's really, really hard to pull off. Custom hardware is hard. I just don't know if it's actually going to ship. I hope so. I hope it does. It's a little bit on the pricey side. I believe it's about $600, but it does look wicked, wicked cool. I mean, it would just make a great bring anywhere with you Linux machine slash handheld game player. It's just totally, totally awesome. And it just, and fits in your pocket. It's like getting a Nintendo DS, except it's got a hardware physical thumb keyboard and runs, actual Linux. I know you can put Linux on a Nintendo DS, but it's a very, very underpowered. But this would have decent power. So of course you want it, Jason. I hope it ships. I hope it ships. Please prove my skepticism wrong on this one, Pyra people. I know you can do it. Scotty Awesome Sauce says, credit to you, Linux Thursday, 2-ish weeks ago for this. It seems like everyone thinks Canonical is going to get bought out by Microsoft. I don't know if credit should go to me on this one. I think a lot of people have been thinking this one for a while. I just said it very loudly. However, I don't see people talking about something that seems more likely to me. Google will buy them. What is your opinion on this? I think it's entirely possible. I think Scotty Awesome Sauce, who has an awesome sauce name, I think has a point. Realistically, I think there's real potential for Amazon, Google, and Microsoft to all pick up Canonical. Specifically for the cloudy side of things, for Azure, for Google Computer, for AWS, there's real value in picking up that team that's been working on it and picking up that ecosystem that's been building of people who are used to working with Ubuntu-based machines on those platforms already, and now there would be a de facto. There's some real value there. There's real value there in the fact that you tend to be able to run a lot of Ubuntu machines on all three of those environments. So if, let's say, Google comes along and buys Canonical, well, now over on Microsoft Azure and Amazon AWS, a whole lot of people are going to be running Microsoft Ubuntu. Or Google Ubuntu or whatever, right? I mean, you're then running your competitor's Linux as your primary, most often used, at least for small to medium size payloads, virtual machine. And that's cool. I mean, that's a good place to be for trying to win over more customers and winning over mind share of developers. So there's real value there just in that alone. And I really do think there's a bigger value proposition, to use a terrible phrase, in Microsoft picking up Canonical, because Microsoft already has GitHub. And if Microsoft has GitHub and then Canonical on top of that, holy moly. I mean, then they then own two of the biggest brands in open source. And I know big chunks of GitHub are closed source, and big chunks of what Canonical do are closed source as well. But just the same, most of what both companies do are a little more open, and they certainly advertise and are popular among the open source and free software worlds. So I think that's a more likely purchase, especially when you have Google looking at things like Fuchsia as a potential replacement to Linux, at least on some of the consumer side of things. Then the value of having Canonical and Ubuntu is diminished a little bit. If they were sticking with the Linux boat over at Google and they picked up Canonical and brought Ubuntu along, well, that might be really valuable. That might have some real interest. That said, Canonical and Ubuntu have a really bad track record of shipping consumer systems. Let me qualify that so I don't get yelled at too much. Ubuntu TV, Ubuntu for Android, Ubuntu Touch, Unity. These are things that Canonical has put their emphasis behind that have been very end user driven, whether it's consumers or just general broad populace, but the end user tools, the GUIs, the desktop environments, the running on various consumer devices. Canonical and Ubuntu haven't had a great ability to not only ship those things, oftentimes they just don't ship them, but when they do ship them, they tend to not last for more than a year or two before being canceled. That said, they have a much better track record in the cloudy space. They've stuck with that a bit more for whatever reason they just have. And so if I were Google looking at that, I would probably not be terribly interested in the end user side of that. Their engineering team's just not the engineering team I would pick up for that. However, for the cloudy side, maybe. So you might be right, Scotty. I Canonical, in my opinion, will most likely be bought out. I mean, SUSE got purchased off of Micro Focus by EQT Partners. I mean, SUSE's been passed around like a hot potato lately. Red Hat getting picked up by IBM. Canonical is just sitting out there. They're going to get picked up. I don't see... someone's going to make Mark Shuttleworth an offer, if they're not already in discussions right now, that he's not going to want to pass up. It's just going to happen. And it might be a great thing for Canonical and Ubuntu. It might be really, really good. Or it might be the end of Canonical and Ubuntu as we know it. It's kind of hard to tell. I don't really know which way it's going to go. Nathan asks, crazy hypothetical. Ooh, good. Canonical acquires Microsoft. Say what now? When the dust settles, what does the resulting company look like? Canonical acquires Microsoft. Okay. All right. I'm going to suspend my disbelief and run with this hypothetical. How many former Microsoft projects does Canonical cancel? So let's assume hypothetically then that Mark Shuttleworth is now in charge of Microsoft. Does Canonical Windows suck as much as Microsoft Windows? Is Office open sourced? How does this impact Ubuntu and the rest of the Linux world? Holy smokes, what would happen? So let's say Mark Shuttleworth is now the head of this combined joint Canonical Microsoft. Let's call it Canasoft. Maybe? No, that doesn't feel quite right. Whatever it's called. Let's say Mark Shuttleworth's at the top of it. Do they open source Office? Probably not. I mean, Canonical doesn't always open source things. I mean, they just don't always. They have a number of their services that they just didn't worry about open sourcing. And I don't hate them for that. It's just, that wasn't necessarily a priority for them. I mean, they're mostly a free and open source software company, and I love them for that. Kudos on them for that, but I don't see them coming into owning a closed source company and saying, we've got open source everything, even though the cost and the licensing and the patents involved might be prohibitive. How many former Microsoft projects does Canonical cancel? I don't know. I think most of them. Canonical cancels projects. That's what they do. I think they'll keep around everything that's making a lot of money, and then anything that's not making a lot of money right now, I think they cancel. That's what Canonical does. That'd be crazy, but I think that's what they do. And then how would it impact Ubuntu? I think you'd basically just see Ubuntu tied to a bunch of Microsoft online services that are making money, and they'll just use that to make more money. That's what I would expect them to do. I think that they would be doing a disservice to their shareholders not to do that. And how it impact the rest of the Linux world? I think it would just, honestly, it would make for a ton of angry articles and videos everywhere. The social medias would erupt. Oh my heavens, the things that would be said on Reddit, and a lot of people would leave Ubuntu for other systems. I mean, that's just what would happen. Luckily, thankfully, there is no possible way Canonical can afford to pick up Microsoft, and that will never happen. That would almost be worse somehow than Microsoft picking up Canonical, and that seems odd to me. Gonna get emails about that statement. Matthew asks, in the past, we have seen big things come out of garages and dorm rooms. Apple, Facebook, Linux. Most of these came about with a paradigm shift and an enemy to fight. Apple fighting IBM during the rise of the personal computer. Yeah. Facebook fighting MySpace during the rise of the social network. All right. Linux fighting monopoly Microsoft to give power of the OS back to the user. At a certain point, yeah, that did kind of kick in. In your opinion, what is the next paradigm shift? And who is the enemy to fight? Oh, that one's easy. It's Google. No matter, here's the thing. It's absolute power corrupts absolutely, the old adage. Even if it doesn't corrupt you absolutely, that a massive amount of power that Google has does corrupt them. And we've seen that happen, right? And so I think the paradigm shift is going to be away from centralized data collecting services and towards not having your data collected. I think that's the paradigm shift. And it's a silly paradigm shift that needs to happen. It's crazy to me that that would even need to happen. But I think that's just the way it's going to go. I think that's going to be the next big one. Google is going to be the enemy. And honestly, as crazy as this seems, I think you're going to see multiple companies that are already gearing up for this fight that are diametrically normally very opposed to each other. You have all of the Linux companies. Yeah, right? They're pushing that route. You see companies that are making a firm stance, like Purism with the Librem 5, right? They're going to come out with a phone. It's like the anti-Google phone. Doesn't track you because the company's not in the marketing data collecting business, and they make a firm stance on that. But you're also going to see more of companies like Apple picking that same fight, just like they did with IBM. Just like they did with Microsoft, pinning themselves as the underdog, even though they're this massive, massive corporation. They're gonna posit themselves, and they're gonna frame the debate as they're the company that is not going to spy on you so much. TM. There you go, Apple. That's your new tagline. The company that doesn't spy on you so much. TM. I think you're going to see Apple pushing in that regard. I think you're going to see Microsoft pushing down in that regard as well. They haven't as much as Apple has or as some of the more Linux and free software companies have. But I think Microsoft, you're going to see them trying to push it as well. I think everyone's going to go after Google, not just because they're big dog, but because they're big dog who is making people uncomfortable. It's hard to turn on the news and not see things where Google is a problem. Right. And regardless of your political spectrum, you end up looking at Google and being like, that's a problem. Right. And regardless of your politics, regardless of your platform and operating system of choice, regardless on your stance of open source versus closed source, you look at Google and you go, yeah, that's gotta be dealt with. And so I think you're going to see people go after Google. I know a lot of people talk about the concerns around Facebook, but come on, I just stopped using Facebook. It's literally one service. Just stop using it and go somewhere else. It can be kind of a difficult thing to get people off of, but it's like a little bit of crack. It's like, yeah, it's crack and it's addictive and it's hard to get people off of crack, but it's just crack. You get them off of crack and you're done. You're off of crack. Google is like every drug on the planet plus water and electricity. It's hard to cut out all those things because some of them are actually good for you when you need them. And so, yeah, I think people are going to go after Google. That's the next one. And I think personally, there's a number of companies, some of whom I talk with on a regular basis, and some of whom I've never even heard of yet, that are exactly in that garage dorm room atmosphere or small startup to mid-sized company phase right now, that are going to go after companies like Google in roundabout ways. They're just going to simply position themselves as the anti-Google. They're not fighting Google. They're just not like Google. They just don't do business like Google. And as people become more increasingly disenchanted with the constant data collection and harvesting, the constant marketing, the constant spying, all of that stuff, the vendor lock-in, they're going to be looking for the alternative, and those alternatives will be there, and I think they'll do well. I think we're going to see a couple of companies come up both in hardware and software and do incredibly well. Maybe not unseat the likes of Apple and whatnot, but do incredibly well and become kind of poster children for that sort of a thing. I think that's how it's going to go. The Linux gamer. Hey buddy, how you doing? Here's a question about you. All right. What kinds of content do you enjoy on YouTube or other platforms? It pertains to Linux because you're a high-profile figure in the Linux world. I don't know about that, buddy, but I'll take the question anyway. You know what? I watch The Linux Gamer. I watch a lot of retro stuff on YouTube. If I watch YouTube videos, it's things like Lazy Game Review. It's like things like the 8-Bit Guy. It's a wide variety of sort of retro gaming and old computer nostalgia and old tech nostalgia channels. I enjoy those because it brings me back to a happier, calmer, less spied on place, and I enjoy that about things. If I'm not on YouTube, and I'm mostly, honestly, not watching things necessarily on YouTube, I'm more watching old movies, 1980s TV shows. I'm a big fan of, like, let's say Battlestar Galactica, the original 1980 version, like the old, sorry, not the 80 version, but the original Battlestar Galactica. The A-Team, love the A-Team. The original A-Team, love that show. Stuff like that, there's just lots of older shows I really get into. There's a couple of new shows that I really dig. But for the most part, I don't watch a ton of new TV or new videos or new content. I listen to some radio shows, I listen to old radio plays, watch a lot of old movies, that sort of thing. It's just how I am. What can I say? I'm a fuddy-duddy. If I'm watching sci-fi, I'm mostly liking the sci-fi from mid to early 1990s and before. 1970s and early 1980s sci-fi is my jam. I just like it a lot. What can I say? That's just how I do. I like Star Trek. I like Star Trek, the original series. I like some of Star Trek, The Next Generation quite a lot. I don't really get into the current Star Trek, though I do like the Orville. The Orville is pretty good. I liked the first season of the Orville. That really made me smile quite a lot. And other than that, I do watch a little bit of cartoons, Bob's Burgers and things like that. Those are fun shows. And this episode, we're not done yet. This is the midway point. Strap in, boys and girls. We got a ways to go. Lulzbot 3D printers also help sponsor this show and make it possible. They make the most glorious 3D printers on planet Earth. If you go to lulzbot.com, man, you can pick from different tools heads, different sizes of 3D printers. You can get the mini, which isn't really that mini. Like it's a good size 3D printer. Got a nice 6x6 by 6 inch print area. It's glorious. Or you can get the Taz, which is more of an 11 point something inch print area. It's absolutely phenomenal. Very industrial strength, good stuff. Filaments, print heads. It's glorious. Go check them out over at lulzbot.com. Plus, they like free software and open source hardware. You can't really go wrong with that. All right. Continuing the questions, and we're at 47 minutes, so I'm going to try and power through these as fast as I can. Just one thought crossed my mind this week. Veritanuda? Just one? Oh, would Linux have been able to have grown so fast and so diversely if it had not switched to Git from BitKeeper? Ooh, good question. I mean, assuredly, there had not been bad blood around that time. Could Linux today seriously have been continued to be curated on a proprietary platform? I find that concept quite hard to wrap my head around, really. Veritanuda asked a really good question. So for the little trip down history lane on this one. Linux was not always developed using Git as the source code repository. It's actually jumped between a couple of different platforms over the years. One of them was BitKeeper. Now, BitKeeper is a proprietary, closed source, lockdown platform. There was a point in time in the early 2000s where our beloved Linus was getting burnt out, right? He was getting crispy. He simply was not able to keep up with the commits and the patches coming in, and it was increasing. He couldn't do it. And so it was decided that something needed to change. Well, BitKeeper functionality-wise was BitKeeper was closer to Git functionality-wise. Git did not exist. Git had not been created yet. And Linus was in contact with the guy who ran the company behind BitKeeper, who I believe, gosh, if memory serves me, I believe he was also a Linux kernel developer. At least he'd submitted some patches. Excuse me. And the guy behind BitKeeper, the company, said, you know what? You guys in the Linux kernel can use this for free. You can use this for free. Go for it. And it's not open source. It's closed as all heck, but you can use it, and it's going to meet your needs and allow Linus to scale a little better. So the Linux kernel switched over to it, and it was contentious. It was problematic. Richard Stallman was pissed off about it. Linus had some reservations. A lot of people were upset about it, but it did allow Linus to scale a little bit better. Well, things went bad, and eventually Linus is like, you know what? I'm done using BitKeeper. I'm done using a closed source tool for this. And so Linus created Git. And if Linus hadn't created Git, in theory, we could have still had Linux being developed on a closed source control platform to this day. So how would that have impacted its adoption? And I think it would have impacted it very little. And here's why. Here's why I think it would have impacted very little. It would have impacted it for people like me, and maybe people like you, and definitely people like Richard Stallman. But a huge amount of the people investing their time and energy into, adding new device drivers and new features and new bug fixes to the Linux kernel and new platforms were being paid to do so by for-profit companies, most of whom earned the vast majority of their revenues on closed source software and closed hardware. They didn't really have a problem with the source control solution being closed source. It was more the free software purists and the open source purists that were upset by that. And so I think you would have lost some of the contributors, and maybe they would have gone somewhere else. But I think, honestly, the biggest thing is you would have eventually maybe lost Linus. Linus might have just grown really, really tired of that, which he did, and that's why he created Git. So honestly, I think there probably wouldn't have been a huge change, and it would have been weird, and it might have been a real source of disdain for folks like me and you. But I think Linux as a kernel would have continued onward, and would Microsoft have had a problem? IBM have had a problem? No, I don't think they would have had a problem with jumping on board with that. I mean, maybe the likes of Red Hat. Red Hat does have a pretty good track record of, even when they acquire companies who are closed source, they eventually find ways to open up the code. So maybe that would have been a problem for them at some point, but it wasn't stopping them at that point. So why would it have later? I think they would have kept going. I think it would have kept going, as crazy as that is. Keith says, the internet is moving from freedom to corporate dictatorship. It's increasingly important we maintain our own data as well as storing content and media ourselves. Describe your current LAN and NAS situation and what you do and what do you want in the future to further your data independence. So I have two things going on right now. I'll make this short and sweet. One, I have a remote server that I have hosted by a hosting company that runs Nextcloud for my offsite backup solution, and then I have a Raspberry Pi with some hard drives attached to it. It is real ghetto. But it works really well. I would like to get a more robust NAS box here at some point because obviously I deal with a lot of content files. I mean, just the source for the videos alone is just massive and huge. Plus, I like to back up all the source code I've worked on over the years and all the documents I've written. I've written a bunch of books, and I keep all those in there, and all the family photos and my music archive and my personal video archive, and it gets massive. And so right now, I'm kind of bursting at the seams. I've got a couple hundred gigs free on my NAS, which is just a Raspberry Pi 3. and I need to come up with something. I think I determined at my current burn rate of adding storage to it, I think I'm going to need to come up with something by about like March or April. So I've got a little bit of time. I'm not sure what I'm going to go with. I know Pogo Linux has some really nice NASs I've been looking at. There's a lot of other great options there. I might just expand further my Raspberry Pi machine because it is working well enough. But I'm not sure. That's what I do. I try and keep as much control over it as possible. I don't like other people having control. I don't like using like Dropbox or OneDrive or Google Drive or whatever. I don't use those. Those aren't great. I think I do have a free Dropbox account still. I used to use it back when I did an old podcast, and when we synced files around, they like to do it via Dropbox. But otherwise, I don't think I use one. At least I haven't logged into one for a while. But that's what I do. I like that because I like to have control. Just like you say, it's nice to have your own control of your own data, but I like to have it local and offsite, and that proves challenging sometimes. Christy Johns asks, it seems like most of the browsers on the market are based on Chromium, right, nowadays, and the only browser that really competes with that trend is Firefox. Do you think it's a bad thing that 90% of the browsers are based on Chromium? Should we as a community invest in something else or start a new project? After all, it makes sense not to reinvent the wheel all over again, so basing everything on a stable Chromium base seems logical. What are your opinions about this? Yes, I have a hard time with this one. So I'm of two minds here. The first is that, like Microsoft's Edge, Brave, every web browser seems to be based off of Chromium, or it's all based on that same core. So, there are differences between the various web browsers, to be sure, but that same core rendering engine is being used everywhere except for Firefox and a few Firefox derivatives. I actually don't really see the value. Now, this is gonna, again, go into territory where I'm gonna get emails. I don't see the value in trying to have multiple HTML plus JavaScript plus blah, 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 huge web framework rendering engines that accomplish roughly the exact same thing in almost the exact same way. That confuses me. I would, however, really love to see more web rendering engines that tackle things in fundamentally different ways with entirely different sets of principles. Case in point, in Chrome and Chrome derivative browsers, or Firefox and their derivatives, you have roughly the same set of DRM plugin options, right? For viewing DRM'd content, roughly. Why? What's the point of having two very different browser engines, with one of which is supposed to be by a corporation, which makes $500 million a year, that's producing that's supposed to be pushing the free and open internet, but really it's just as locked down as the other guy? What's the point of that? I would prefer to see one side take a crazy free stance, no DRM ever, massive features focusing on openness and transparency. I would like to see that more. I think that would be fundamentally interesting, and it would theoretically cause problems in market share. It would cause divisions, but I don't really mind that so much. I would still like to see it. I would also like to see and there are some of these projects out there as well, Dillo and a few others. We have HTML rendering engines that are much more simple. But I would like to see maybe a couple of the smaller projects come together that focus on simple HTML rendering engines and all work together on like one core, good, really simple HTML, like the really embracing the core of what the web is and always was. That way, there's at least a couple of really distinct differences, because it confuses me. It was strange that Microsoft had their Edge, whatever it was, the Titan rendering engine that was essentially chasing Firefox and Gecko and Chromiums and everything else. It was all chasing each other. They were just trying to stay essentially on par with each other. And what's the point of that? I get why Microsoft ditched their rendering engine for something else, because that they were already chasing to start with. When it was open source, they could just use it. That makes sense to me. I would have preferred almost to see Microsoft say, you know what, we're going to do something fundamentally different with our rendering engine. Just totally different. I would have almost preferred that. Because different means that maybe something cool will come out of it. That's personally my thoughts. James asks, there's a gorgeous configuration of a Dell XPS 13 on sale at Costco for $350 off regular price, but it comes with Windows. Oh, ouch. I'd rather order one with Linux pre-installed, of course you would, just to make a point. But I don't think the point is worth $300 to $50. Ooh, I get you on that one, man. What do you think? When are we going to get more choices at retail, especially with systems like this that we know run Linux great? This is a great point. It is... I don't necessarily even like that computers always ship with operating systems. I don't know. I remember when we used to build machines and we'd bought our own operating system or downloaded our own operating system to put on there. I kind of like that. But yeah, no, I get your point. Is $350 worth making the point that I'm buying a Linux system? I don't know, man. For $350, geez, that's a lot of Raspberry Pis. Do you buy a stack of 10 Raspberry Pis and build yourself a Raspberry Pi cluster of power and glory to go along with that Dell XPS 13? Or do you just get the Linux preloaded XPS 13? That's a really good question. Barton George, if you're watching, you're the man who is behind the plan of Project Sputnik over at Dell, who puts together the XPS 13s with Linux. What's the deal with that? Get your machines with Linux into Costco and whatnot, man. Come on, James. Or you could just go buy a Purism laptop. Anyway, there's always that. Karsten asks, please tell me how I can convince my boss and our IT supplier to switch to Linux. My laptop with the OS you should not name was broken and needed a reinstallation, and now I am forced to work with Windows 10. Sick. Oh, you are not alone, my friend. How to convince them? Just keep at it. I mean, it's really a cost issue. If you can show them, put together a virtual machine. Install on it the software you need for your virtual machine. Show them how it does the job for your job perfectly. Use that virtual machine for your job. Show them, and then show them how in the future they might be able to save some money with that going forward, because they won't need new licenses and potentially new support agreements. And so they might be able to save a couple of bucks that way. And show them how you don't even have a virus scanner on there, probably, because you probably don't need one. That's probably your best bet. It's a hard road, man. It is not an easy road. Good luck to you. There's one more question. We can do this, but this episode is brought to you. We've already talked a lot about Purism, so I'm not going to talk about it a lot more, other than to say thank you, Purism, for helping to support this show and make it possible. Thank you to Pogo Linux. Thank you to Lulzbot. Thank you to Purism. Purism's website, puri.sm. All right. Last question. I think this is the last question. No, two more. We got this. Mr. Make It asks, so this may be a far too common question, but I hope the twist makes it interesting. Let's say that tomorrow some large corporation, maybe Google, decided to buy, man, this is a theme going on, I tell you, decided to buy up as many Linux distributions as possible. And I guess it makes sense. You know, with IBM buying Red Hat, I mean, this is on everyone's mind, is Linux getting purchased. Decided to buy up as many Linux distributions as possible and simply shut them down. No one else is going to attempt to save these distros. Linus will continue developing the kernel, and the GNU tools will still be developed, but it becomes your responsibility to save and manage one last distro. What distro will you save? Oh, which distro? If I could pick one, I'm going to grab Debian. I mean, I'm just gonna. Debian's been around. It's been rock solid for about 47,000 years. They don't always do everything perfectly, but they try really hard and they get real close. They make a system that's phenomenal, and some of the best distributions out there are based on top of Debian. So you go with Debian, you're going to get the largest amount of users who are already familiar with the tool sets, the Ubuntu users and the Pure OS users and the Pop OS users and all these other Debian based distros, the elementary users. Everything is all downstream from Debian. So I'd go with Debian. Sorry, Ubuntu and Fedora and Arch and Gentoo and etc., folks. Your systems are great, but just going on that alone, on the pure market share alone and mind share, I'd go with Debian. That's what I do. And Debian has a long history of being able to pull stuff off in a scrappy ragtag way without any company necessarily behind it. I like that. And in this sort of situation, this sort of crazy hypothetical, we're going to need that scrappiness. So I'd go with Debian. Turnover, final question. And this is a question that is kind of close to my heart. Hi, I'm 40-something. Hi, Turnover. Nice to see you, buddy. I have some 20-something friends. Not that he's saying he has 20 friends or so. Like he has friends in their 20s. It's hard to explain to them why Microsoft was so bad before Linux and why we need Linux. Please help. This is fundamental. There is a huge amount. You see me getting adjusted in my seat because this really is a topic that's important. There's a huge amount of knowledge, of things that we understood, of history that people have forgotten, or that huge amounts of us just simply never knew because we weren't around back then. So many of the developers in the Linux world were not around in the early 90s or the 80s. They did not witness the way things went in the computing industry. They haven't been around to see the patterns as various companies have tried different things and failed, as various vendors like Microsoft have done various shady things and succeeded. They were not around to see this happen. They were not around to see what they did to Linux. And what's more, many of them didn't experience the pain of having systems like, let's say, Windows 95A. It was brutal. And I try my best to tell them about what happened. And there are some other people out there doing that as well. And I hope that more do, because there is this huge collection of knowledge that we are slowly losing. When I did the brief history of Linux abridged last year it was at Linux Fest Northwest, and I had 45 minutes to give a brief history of Linux. And when I sat down to do that, I originally put together I can't remember how many slides it was, 100, 200 slides. It was insane. And I realized I had to narrow down and focus. So I had to start chopping slides out. Huge pieces of Linux history I just couldn't have time to cover in the allotted time. And I wanted to be able to show people so much of where we came from so that they can appreciate where we are and what we have. What we have in this amazing Linux desktop and server and mobile devices, embedded machines, what we have here is amazing. And unless you understand where we come from, sometimes it's easy to lose sight of just how amazing it is. And so I started chopping out a lot of things that you'd normally think were pretty critical parts of Linux and Linux's history in exchange for how we got to Linux. History of Unix, history of the GNU project, history of the people involved, and not just what they did, but why. What was their motivation for what they did at each step of the way? What machines were they doing? How hard was it? Talking about Ken Thompson and Dennis Ritchie, and then they were building what basically became the first version of Unix, which, by the way, is spelled UNICS. People need to remember that. UNIX is a misspelling of Unix. UNICS is how it was always spelled. And somewhere along the line, the CS just became an X. And nobody who was involved in those early days of Unix has a clue why that happened. That's a totally true thing, by the way, which means that the X in Linux should have been a CS. Linux. Weird? Perhaps. But it's an important thing to know. And to know that when they were building that first version, they were doing so because they were building a series of tools to build a video game on older machines. I believe it was on Multics at the time. Or was it pre-Multics? No. It wasn't pre-Multics, but it was aside from Multics. Anyway, go watch the History of Linux Abridged for all the details on that. And knowing how difficult it was for them, because they had to code it on one machine, print it out on paper tape and punch cards, and bring them on over to new machines in order to get them up and running. And the difficulty in all of that was obscene. And how hard it was before we, in the Linux world, had our first graphical user environment. And what all had to go into the development before that would even be possible. And the people involved that we've just forgotten about to get there. There was so much that we've lost. There's so much history that we don't know about anymore. And that's really sad to me. How do you tell the 20-something-year-old people in a way that's going to make sense to them the pain that we all had to endure through the 80s and 90s and even the early aughts before we had this amazing Linux systems that we've got nowadays? And why Windows and Microsoft were so bad, not just from a usability standpoint, but what they did as a company, why it was so bad and scarred so many of us. It's really hard to explain that. It's sort of like, and I do not want to belittle anyone here, so yeah. It's sort of like when people go through traumatic experiences like a war or a trip that goes horribly awry or something where you have an experience with your band of brothers and you have that experience and it's so particular to that place and time. I'm not comparing, by the way, a bunch of software engineers and nerds dealing with having to use Windows to being in war. I'm just making the comparison of things where it's a unique experience. And it's difficult for someone who wasn't there to fully understand and appreciate just how unique it was or just how hard it was. Explain it to them. Show them. Maybe force them to sit down and use it for a while. I'm a firm believer that if you are going to be an engineer, like a real software engineer, like a real one, not like a JavaScript guy. Not like a guy who toys around with Ruby. Yeah, I'm making fun of a couple of my friends with that one. But like a real engineer. Still making fun of a few of my friends there. Sorry, guys. I couldn't help it. But if you're really going to do that, you got to go back and you got to spend a month and use nothing but Atari TOS. And then another month living on the Amiga Workbench. And then another month living on Windows 3.1.1 for workgroups. And then another month in Windows 95A. And then a whole 2 months in Windows Millennium Edition. Yeah, you got to suffer through that one. And I feel like you got to go through those moments. And then you got to use OS 2 as your only platform. 1 full year. I feel like it should be required in computer science courses. You should have to do every part of your homework. Every month you have to pick a different platform. And you have to use it. And it has to be an old one. And it has to be one that, man, was rough around the edges. And then, at the end of it, maybe, you understand the pain that some of us went through. Maybe. And I'm not even that old. I'm sitting around there with turnover age-wise. There's guys that came before me, and oh man, the Thompsons and the Dennis Richies and the whatnot of the world, the stuff they had to endure was fierce. I can only imagine. Anyway, that brings us to the end of this week's show, which is good because my voice is going. I'm still fighting this cold. Hopefully by the time next week's shows roll around, I will be right as rain. But if you would like to subscribe to the MP3 audio podcast of this show, you can go over to lunduke.com. There's a little MP3 link for that. You can listen to it over there. You can also grab the video for this, not just on YouTube, but over on LBRY as well. There's a link to my library account there. I've got a library channel set up, which is a really cool, very decentralized, blockchain-y video distribution platform. So you can go check it out all up there. Or if you just like a direct download, good old-fashioned HTTP download of the DRM-free MP4 version of the video file, there's an RSS feed. And that's a kind of a perk for my Patreon supporters. You go over to patreon.com/Brian Lunduke. There's also a link on lunduke.com. You can get that all there. And if you would like to read my articles, I've been writing Linuxy articles since the dawn of time, since monkeys were banging on giant rectangle things with little bones and such. I've been writing Linuxy articles, but nowadays I'm writing them for Linux Journal. I'm the deputy editor over there now. You can go over to linuxjournal.com and grab a subscription, monthly magazine. The current one that's out is all about supercomputers. I've got actually an article on the history of supercomputers and how the history of supercomputers led up to the history of Linux dominating supercomputers. It's a really interesting history, and I think people need to know more of this stuff. I'm going to be doing a lot more historical stuff as we go forward because honestly, I hate that we're losing some of this information. And I think as many of us as possible that know some of this stuff need to get this information out there and document it in as many ways as possible. So go check that over at Linux Journal. And yeah, subscribe to my YouTube channel because that's glorious. All right, an hour 16. I'm not completely hoarse yet, only mildly. I want to thank everyone for supporting this show. I really do. We're pulling to the close of 2018 here. And I'm feeling real lucky. I've had amazing companies support this show over the years. Pogo Linux has been with me since literally the beginning. They're amazing. The folks over at Lulzbot, they've been with me for a long time too. Amazing. They've helped to make so much of this possible. They help support the free software community. Love those guys. Purism, oh man, they do stuff that's really close to my heart with their laptops and their phones. Mwah, glorious. And you know, past supporters of this show too, including System 76, they're doing great stuff over there as well. Thank you to all the supporters of this show, the sponsors, the corporate sponsors, past and present, the people who support this show on Patreon. And if you don't like Patreon for whatever reason, no judging. I also have some other options I'm trying to add as we go. If you go to lunduke.com, if you want to pitch in $1, pitch in $1 million, whatever, you can go over there. I've got a little PayPal link. You can buy some clothes. I've got some more books coming up there that'll appear there. And I'll try and get some crypto awesome coiny things going on as well. And I really mean it. From the bottom of my heart, thank you to all of you for making 2018 just huge for me. Just absolutely just mammoth. In November, we had more people watch my shows than I've ever experienced before. Over 1 million people watched my shows in 1 month. And I know there are YouTubers out there that they get that with a 47-second video where they just kind of sneezed. But, you know, we're talking about Linux. We're talking about free software. We're talking about privacy. And we're talking about the gloriousness of how computing can be amazing. And to see 1 million views of that content, that warms my heart. That warms my heart. I've never been involved in a show, a podcast, anything that came even close to those numbers. Not even a fraction. And that's not because of me. That's because of you. I could not have done any of this without every single one of you. Love you guys and gals, dudes and dudettes alike. Love you all. And before I head out, if I could leave you all with one parting thought. Out in our world right now, and I'm talking about our tech world, our community of nerdy, open sourcey, free software, Linuxy, alternative operating system-y people, there's a lot of conflict and strife. There's a lot of people pissed off at each other and saying some kind of mean things about each other and fighting with each other all the time. And I just want to say this. There is a lot more that binds us together than drives us apart. Maybe someone's gotten a little bit upset about some code of conduct over there. Maybe someone's upset because some conference over there has not nice people at it. Maybe someone's project has on their board of directors someone who mouths off over on the tweeters sometimes. And maybe the people that, on a project you care about are politically just totally different from you. But for the core of what we do, the core of who we are as nerds, as real nerds, because if you're watching this show, you're a friggin' nerd. And I mean that in the most glorious possible way. There is more that binds us together as a people than drives us apart. Try your best, please, just to be cool to each other. If you're watching this show, you may have a wide variety of political views. You may have a wide variety of religious, whatever views. And you're welcome here. Always. Please be cool to each other. And I love you all. All right. Have a great the rest of 2018. Have a truly righteous 2019. And above and beyond all else, be excellent to each other. I'll see you guys later.